Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining me for this SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. I'm your host, Marty Bennett, and today on the Roundup, we're going to be taking a look at top 3 questions that we're asking in international education this week. It's great to have you all back with us on the Roundup, and as we enter the reopening stage 1, 2, 3, or 4, depending on where you are in the United States and the world, we're going to take a look at 3 important questions that international educators have been asking this past week based on news that we've seen. And we're going to start, as we always do, with our SMIE Consulting e-newsletter. This comes out on Monday mornings at 9 a.m. Eastern and includes a series of about 15 to 30 international education news stories, as well as 5 or so social media stories that can be relevant for international educators, oftentimes very appropriately so. And we take 3 of those international ed stories each week from the Monday edition of the e-newsletter and profile them here, or groups of them here, on the Roundup. To go more in depth, to take a look at broader issues related to those topics. Today we're going to be taking a look at those three issues that are front and center for most international educators these days. The first of which is the sky falling with regards to U.S.-China relationships. Based on the recent executive order that we went into last week, we'll talk more about how that's being viewed in the press. We'll also look at how current students and future students are viewing the options that many colleges are talking about this fall about reopening. And we'll look and see what that means and some of the implications for new and returning students. And finally, we're going to shift gears and look at what's happening in Australia. They're about to begin their second term of the academic year that started in February, or kick-started in February, partially started, I should say, for international students. They're going to take in a cohort in mid-year for them, and that means starting in July, there's going to be some new options for international students to enter into Australian universities, and we'll talk more about those specifics in a little bit. But let's first start with China. It seems like this is the story that, or the topic that has been with us for several years. Certainly the over-dependence on China as a primary source of students for U.S. college campuses is certainly one that we see happening all over the place, and it has been one that's been with us for several years. So that's not certainly anything new that's going on. But what is new is we take a look at what's happening in the last few weeks and months surrounding coronavirus, and it's really taken another step up to indicate now what's happening regarding China. It's really seems to have, the issues related to our challenges with China have ratcheted up, to say the least. We talked about the piece of legislation that Senator Tom Cotton proposed 3 or 4 weeks ago, that would ban all Chinese graduate STEM students. Then came the executive order, which was actually, if you're asking me, probably the best case scenario, and one, frankly, that probably wasn't uncalled for, and that was to revoke visas for Chinese students and scholars that are currently in the United States that are graduate STEM, yes, but funded specifically by the China civil military fusion industry. And what that, though wisely, the executive order did not spell out specific companies or fronts or organizations that fell under this civil military fusion strategy that the executive order outlined, because frankly, if this is the issue that we think it is, and I certainly believe there's a lot of truth to the espionage that's going on and has been going on for years, not just in the last 2 or 3 years, but certainly there were back in February, FBI Director Wray rolled out over 1,000 cases of intellectual espionage. 900 of those in the United States in the past year included Chinese influences. So what is happening now with this relationship. This Barron's article that I've just posted the link to on the Facebook page includes a fairly dreary look on things, and has as its core basically saying it's time to prepare for a messy divorce between the U.S. and China. The very conscious decoupling, as the article's title makes out. It's it focuses a lot on the tech side of things and the trade issues involved, but it does make reference to the students that are impacted here, and makes reference to the revocation of visas for several thousand Chinese students that some of the postgraduates are connected to China's civil military industry. So that's certainly something that's got legs. I'm of the opinion, and this next article from the LA Times certainly takes a similarly gloomy view, and actually calls the new executive order the new Chinese Exclusionary Act, and Exclusion Act, and frankly, I think that's clickbait, and how that's going to hurt California universities, which are overly dependent on China, to be honest. And it's while there have been many things that this administration has said and done over the last 3 or 4 years that have been antagonistic towards China, largely the bottom certainly hasn't dropped out. Is it about to? Certainly this fall, it's going to drop out for everybody, not just China, but because of the pandemic. But certainly for is the bottom going to drop out because, and the numbers we've been told, having had a couple more articles come through and some people in the know who've provided this background information, is we're talking about 3,000 of the over 300,000 Chinese students currently in the United States and scholars. Only 3,000 are impacted in this direct military-civil fusion strategy, where these organizations that fund students to come study and scholars to come to the United States at the particularly postgraduate level and research level and steal technology, intellectual property theft. That's a legitimate reason the U.S. government should be concerned. And if those have been identified and are prosecutable, and some of them are happening, then these are the kinds of things that, frankly, the U.S. needs to be doing to protect its own interests. And technologies, frankly, that are military grade and issues that China would seek to exploit. So certainly there's real wariness on the part of the government based on the history of intellectual espionage. And this is Trump's executive order, as scarily as it may seem, is actually a very targeted and specific and frankly fairly legitimate approach to a problem that exists in our country. By taking this action, it's a targeted approach of 3,000 that are directly linked to military-civil fusion industry in China and are funded that way. And by revoking visas, that will eliminate them from future challenges. They'll find new ways, I'm sure. It's the nature of politics and espionage and such, but it's a problem. We're putting an end to it with this, and then this is a much more focused problem than what we saw with Senator Cotton's legislation, which would have impacted potentially 70,000 Chinese students that are graduate STEM focused. Over half of China's international students in the United States are STEM. So at the graduate level, which is a little less than half of the total Chinese students in the U.S., they would, of 300,000, about 140 are graduate. That's half of them would have been potential targets to have visas revoked. That's not happening. It's not 70,000. It's more like 3, and it's a focused one. So of the things that could potentially happen related to visas in China, this is probably the least damaging to relations. And certainly the LA Times article certainly makes it out to be a lot worse than it is. And frankly, the folks that are interviewed are ones that have vested interest in that. So it's certainly, in fact, there's quotes from several university folks that specifically talk to the challenges involved in intellectual property theft with China, and particularly Chinese military. So interesting to see this with regard to something that Trump has done on the visa front. That is actually there is certainly logic and rational thought behind it, and certainly one that I think is being overblown in the press, but that's the nature of election year, and that's certainly the nature of U.S. media as we know it today. So we're going to shift gears now and get to the second question, which is the larger issue of reopening here in the United States. Every state has their own plans for doing it in phases 1, 2, 3, and 4, perhaps, depending on where you are in the U.S. Some are much further along than others because they had fewer cases to begin with, so they were able to open quicker. Some have been doing a very phased-in approach with slow steps, baby steps as they go. Some have opened the doors wide open. There's a lot of data that's out there, some of it conflicting, so it's really there's no clear answers yet. But the challenge is at university campuses across the country, there are now real questions that are being asked regarding opening up, and there have been many institutions that have been on record that they are supportive of a fully in-person experience. Those were probably going to be scaled back due to realities of professors that might be in high-risk categories. Certainly large lecture halls are perhaps and thankfully a thing of the past, and those may all be done virtually, and then seminars or discussion or lab sections would be all done in person in smaller groups, socially distanced. So the actual functionality of what college will look like for students this fall is still to be determined, but the realities are we don't know all the answers yet, and we don't know what physically is going to look like. And it's led to a lot of concern, rightly so, amongst students and parents. The first article we're posting is a link to it's a link to the New Indian Express article talking that's referencing a pandemic changes equations. Career consultants say many parents are scared to send their children to other countries for higher education. So not specifically the United States, but certainly that fear factor is now an important part of the equation for many parents who are making that decision because they're not sure what the realities are going to be on the ground. And frankly, there are universities that frankly don't know what they're going to be doing yet, but they're saying they're going to be open, but they're really planning for online. But there are a lot of consequences to these decisions that institutions are making now that oftentimes completely ignore what's happening on the ground with international students. I think we saw a really significant example of that with Notre Dame a couple weeks ago, where they first announced that they're going to open, they're going to be on campus in the fall. They're going to start actually 2 weeks early and then finish at Thanksgiving, so students could go home for Thanksgiving through the new year before they return to campus, hopefully avoiding a second spike in the fall when flu season hits. But shortly after they made that decision to go 2 weeks early, the president of Notre Dame, Father Jenkins, made the unusual request and sent a letter to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to ask that consulates be reopened so that visa interviews could happen for students to allow their fine class of newly admitted students to arrive in time for the fall term. And that was prompted, no doubt, by someone in the international office in the admissions office going to the president saying, hey, starting early is an absolute death knell for any new international students we wanted to bring to campus this fall, because they're simply not going to be able to get visas. And I've been telling my clients this for several weeks now, that new international students this fall don't expect any unless they're already in country and unless they are maybe transferring from a high school or a community college or an ESL program, or they're coming for a second degree in the United States, don't expect out-of-country internationals to be able to make it here in time for fall classes to begin. It's simply an impractical reality. We talked about it last week, just referencing just the fact that visas aren't open for business yet. Consulates around the world, U.S. consulates, very few are. The only ones that are, they have, certainly in the key source countries for the United States, in India, China, the earliest appointments that anyone can even go online to apply for are October, November, certainly well after the fall term begins. Was the request made by the GOP congressman last week to Secretary of State Pompeo and Chad Wolf in Homeland Security for Pompeo to get the visas open and running again at U.S. consulates and embassies, but also to look at and consider eliminating the visa interview, which is something that there is in emergency circumstances, and in certainly this would qualify perhaps for certainly universities to allow for students to not have to go for the interview and just have it be a paperwork decision. So there's a lot riding on it, but the visa is just, consulates and embassies being open to be able to issue visas is just the first step. When you also look at travel, ability to travel, are they physically going to be able to leave their country by restrictions that their own country has in place, let alone what we have in place here in the U.S.? Are there going to be flights available? Obviously, if the bans are lifted, there'll be more flights, but first there have to be flights. And if there's a huge rush of students at the end of August, middle of August, to come to the United States, will the flights be there? So getting to the U.S. is an issue. Third is, if they can get to the U.S., are there going to be any health restrictions that they're going to need to have? Are they going to need to have had a negative test immediately before departing the U.S.? Will they have to be in quarantine for 2 weeks after they enter the United States if they're able to physically cross the border? So these are things that not only students have to plan for, parents, but also institutions. Because if you have students that there's going to be a mandatory quarantine for any new students coming this fall. If you have a 2-week quarantine where they're going to have to be housed and fed for 2 weeks and not be able to interact with others on campus, how is your campus going to deal with that? You're going to make them pay for a hotel room somewhere for 2 weeks to have them do that on their own? Or are you going to step up and do what you need to do to make sure that they're taken care of, particularly the first 2 weeks in the U.S. if they're going to be in quarantine? So that's a real concern, a legitimate concern. And one that nobody's really thought of yet is, I've certainly talked about it with some clients, is if you do have students that can get the visa in time, that can find a flight, that don't have the health restrictions or can circumvent them in one way or another, and are able to physically enter the country, if your college has decided to go online only, that student, according to DHS regulations, there's been no kind of gray area or exceptions made for new international students that would be entering in the fall. I'm not expecting there to be. Certainly guidance will exist for returning students, but for new international students, they can't start a fully online program and be in valid F1 status. That's just not possible given the current regulations. If they're able to get through all those hurdles, if they were to get here and not be able to start classes this fall, because your college has made the decision to go online. And we're talking about 16 to 20% that have already made the commitment of U.S. colleges and universities to be online, fully online this fall, including the Cal State system and many others. But there are 65% that have said we're going to be online, we're going to be in person this fall. And that's quite a large percentage of U.S. colleges that are saying they're going to be in person. And finances are driving a lot of that in terms of the housing revenue that's generated. That's where a lot of institutions make up their margins for students that they're bringing in, is through those that are living on campus. So that's a big piece of it. But you think about all the other things that are going to need to happen on campus, there are going to be other costs as well. So what are these colleges doing by deciding to go all online? And the fully online is probably the safest bet. Obviously, safety-wise, health-wise, it's the safest bet. And depending on what the tuition amounts are, can be the most practical way for new students, new international students in particular, to start their studies with you before it's fully or much more safe for them to arrive in person, be physically able to get here in person. But for the campuses that are committing to being in person, if you have those international students that you have to change tack at the last minute, international students that are trying to jump through all these hoops to get to you in time for the fall, and maybe some of your classes are going to be online, some of them are going to be in person, large lectures like we were talking about earlier being online. What does that mean to an international student that's coming to the border, is going to have an interview with a Customs and Border Patrol official, and they're going to be asked about, well, what's your campus doing for classes? Are they going to be all online? If they say their class, some or most of their classes are going to be online, I guarantee you, until there's regulations out there, and even if there is, there's probably going to be some miscommunication in the result of it. When that happens, we're talking about students that will not physically be able to enter the United States. They'll be denied entry because they can't attend a fully online program or mostly online program. That's just the regulations. So in terms of what we have to think about as colleges and universities when we make the decisions we do, is international offices need to have a seat at the table when those decisions are getting made about how we're going to be operating in the fall, and because it will impact any new students that come in. So that's a reality. And the other part of what this topic certainly discusses is the student. There was a letter in Inside Higher Ed this past week from an anonymous student from Yale, talking through the various issues of how to stay healthy on campus. What happens when they have to miss classes and they have to be quarantined? Are those courses that they previously were in person going to be available online so they can continue to take them? By having what happens when the professor's sick, who's going to take over? If someone does get sick themselves, what happens there? If there are other circumstances, parents with health conditions that put them at risk, what's happening here? Online is the option that certainly this particular student feels most comfortable with, and you have to wonder what the realities will be for the majority of campuses that have a substantial portion of their faculty that are in the high-risk groups that would be teaching classes, whether they're going to be wanting to return. Certainly there are campuses now that are already planning for fall where most staff will still be remote, and we wonder how that will manifest itself. So we're going to wrap up today with one last topic, and that will hopefully give us some insight as to what's happening in the fall, going to happen in the fall here, and that's in Australia. Prime Minister Morrison announced a pilot program this past week at the National Cabinet meeting in Canberra, where international students will be able to enter the country only on pre-approved plans for particular institutions. Now, the specifics haven't been laid out yet as to what are these pre-approved plans, what are particular institutions, and what they can expect. So there's a lot that's going on that we won't know the details yet, but they're starting to look at reopening for international students in the next month, in July. So we'll certainly keep you informed as to how that's progressing. But there's going to be a lot of details that they need to still work on, some of which we were already talking about here as planning for fall. And that's like, well, are they going to be quarantined? Is there going to be a mandatory period? Well, we know that there's these kinds of challenges certainly exist and have existed we saw that in Canada this past year, that happened, or in February and March, they put in a mandatory 2-week quarantine that students had to go through. So we'll see what happens with that in the days and weeks to come. For now, there's a lot to keep up with, and thanks for bearing with us as we get through this on the Roundup, and we're looking forward to continuing the conversation next week. So thanks again for joining us. For those listening on the podcast, really appreciate you downloading us each week and making us a part of your routine. Thanks so much, and have a great week.